I saw him before he saw me, and my body reacted a full 3 seconds before my brain caught up, heart slamming, palms gone cold. The specific kind of panic you only feel when the past walks into a room wearing a tuxedo and doesn't know you're standing right there. I hadn't seen Marcus Hale in 6 years. I had built an entire adult life on the assumption that I never would again. You okay? Todd asked beside me, and I realized I'd stopped walking in the middle of the reception hall entrance. Fine, I said, which was a lie so immediate and so complete that I almost laughed at myself for bothering. My name is Claire. I'm 29, I do freelance graphic design out of a converted sunroom in my apartment, and I was standing in the doorway of a lakeside reception hall because my best friend since college, Sophie, was getting married that weekend, and I was her maid of honor. Todd was my plus one, a perfectly nice coworker my mother had all but forced into my hands after a full year of her insisting I put myself out there, and up until 90 seconds ago. The evening had been going fine. Pleasant, manageable. Then I'd looked across the room and seen the best man, and every single thing I thought I'd resolved about my early 20s came rushing back at once. Marcus and I dated for 3 years in college. Not a fling, not a phase. 3 real years, the kind where you learn someone's family, their bad habits, the exact tone of voice that meant they were about to cry even when they were trying not to. We broke up the summer after graduation, not because anything went wrong between us, but because a research fellowship in London landed in his lap, and neither of us knew how to ask the other to give something up for it. We said all the mature things people say, we'll see, let's not make promises we can't keep. It was, at the time, the single most adult decision I had ever made, and it had felt, for years afterward, like amputating something without anesthesia. We'd met in a required statistics course neither of us wanted to take, assigned as lab partners because our last names landed next to each other on a roster. And he'd spent the first 3 weeks doing most of the actual math, while I drew increasingly elaborate doodles in the margins of his notes. Which he kept anyway. I found out years later he'd saved half a notebook of them in a box under his bed. We had a song, the way college couples always end up with one, something dumb and unremarkable that came on at a party the night we first kissed. And for the entire rest of undergrad, I couldn't hear it in a grocery store without my whole chest tightening. We had a running joke about a disastrous road trip to see a lighthouse that turned out to be closed for renovation, and we'd stood in the parking lot laughing so hard neither of us could speak. And I remember thinking, with a clarity I didn't have words for at 20, that I could probably do this, whatever this was, for the rest of my life. Then the fellowship letter came, and neither of us had the courage to ask the other to choose differently. And I told myself for 6 years that the ending had been mutual and mature, and therefore should not still ache the way it did. I hadn't known he was coming this weekend. Sophie, I would later learn, had absolutely known and had said nothing, which was either the kindest or the most reckless thing she had ever done for me, depending on how the next 3 days went. You didn't tell me Marcus was the best man, I hissed at her the next morning, cornering her in the bridal suite while she was still in a robe with curlers in. I didn't tell you a lot of things this week. I'm getting married in 6 hours. She caught my face in the mirror and softened. He's Daniel's oldest friend, Claire. I couldn't exactly uninvite him because you two had a thing a decade ago. 6 years, and it wasn't a thing, it was. I didn't finish the sentence because I genuinely didn't know how it ended. The wedding party had a rehearsal walkthrough that afternoon, and because Sophie's seating chart apparently operated on dramatic irony alone, I was paired with Marcus for the processional arm in arm, practicing the same slow entrance 4 times while the wedding coordinator adjusted our pacing. And every single time his hand settled against my forearm, I had to actively remind myself to keep breathing normally. You cut your hair, he said on the third pass, quiet enough that only I could hear it. 6 years ago, yes. I noticed the photo on Sophie's mantle. Took me a second. He was still the same in the ways that mattered, same low, unhurried voice. Same habit of tucking his hands in his pockets when he didn't know what to do with them. But there was a new tiredness around his eyes and a new stillness to him. Like some restless part of him had finally settled. You look good, Claire, you too. It came out stiffer than I meant it to. London treat you well? London was a lot of things. He glanced at me sideways. I moved back about a year ago, actually. That landed somewhere strange in my chest, and I didn't examine why until much later that night. Dinner was a rehearsal dinner at a restaurant on the water. Long tables, string lights. The kind of golden hour lighting that makes everyone look like they're in a film even when they're just passing the bread basket. Todd was seated beside me, sweet and attentive in the way of someone trying very hard, and Marcus was seated almost directly across, close enough that every time I laughed at something Todd said, I could feel Marcus watching, and every time Marcus told some story about a wrong turn in the Cotswolds that had the whole table in stitches, I caught myself watching him back before I could stop it. He seems nice, Marcus said at one point, nodding toward Todd, who'd gone to the bar for another round. He is nice, that's not really an answer. It's the only one I've got tonight, Marcus. He held my gaze a second too long, then let it go. The way he always used to when he knew pushing further would cost more than it was worth. That restraint had driven me up a wall in college. Now it felt like the most considerate thing anyone had done for me in months. Earlier that same day, before any of us had changed into rehearsal clothes, Sophie had roped both of us into hauling boxes of centerpieces from the venue's storage room. And there hadn't been a graceful way to say no without drawing more attention to the tension than I wanted. So we spent 40 minutes carrying candle jars and mason jar arrangements back and forth across a gravel lot, and somewhere around box 6, Marcus started laughing about nothing. And when I asked what was funny, he said, "Nothing. I just forgot how much of my life used to just be doing errands with you, boring stuff. I forgot how much I liked the boring stuff, and I'd had to busy myself with a stack of centerpieces so he wouldn't see my face do something complicated in response. You don't get to say things like that," I told him, only half joking, "and then just go back to being the best man like it's nothing." I didn't say it was nothing, I said I forgot. Those aren't the same sentence. He hefted another box, easy, like the conversation cost him less than it clearly cost me. You can pretend you didn't hear it if that's easier. I hadn't pretended anything. I'd thought about that sentence on and off for the rest of the afternoon. Todd, to his credit, noticed something was off before I could name it myself. Later that night, walking me back to my room, he said carefully, "You two have history. We dated in college. It ended fine, Claire." He said my name gently, not accusingly. "I've known you 4 months and I've never seen you like this. I'm not upset. I just don't want to be the guy standing next to you while you're somewhere else the whole night." I apologized and I meant it. And it didn't change the fact that I lay awake that night replaying a conversation with a man I hadn't spoken to in 6 years instead of thinking about the kind. Steady one asleep 2 doors down. I found Sophie the next morning in the bridal suite hallway, stealing a few minutes alone before hair and makeup descended on her, and I told her in a rush everything: the centerpieces, the doc. The sentence I couldn't stop replaying, the guilt sitting heavy in my stomach about Todd. "You want me to tell you it's fine," Sophie said, not unkindly, pinning a loose curl back into place. "And I'm not going to because it's not for Todd. But Claire, I've known you 12 years, and I have never once seen you look at anyone the way you looked at Marcus carrying that stupid box of candle jars yesterday. Not even when you were actually with him. That doesn't make it okay to just—" I didn't say it made it okay, I said it's true. "Those can both be true at once." She turned to face me fully, mascara wand still in hand. "You're allowed to feel something complicated on my wedding weekend. You're also allowed to be a decent person to Todd while you sort it out. Do both. I have a dress to get into." The twist came the next afternoon, during the lull between the ceremony setup and the actual ceremony. When Sophie sent me to the groomsmen's suite to deliver a missing cufflink box, and I found Marcus alone, sitting on the edge of a chair with his tie half done. Looking like a man bracing for something. "Can I ask you something?" he said before I could hand off the box, "and can you just let me get all the way through it before you say anything?" I nodded. Because the look on his face had already scared the argument right out of me. "About a year ago, right after I moved back, I tried to find you. I got your old number from a mutual friend from school. I didn't even think about whether it might have changed, I just called it, left a message. Then I texted a few days later when you didn't call back. Then I told myself that was my answer, that you'd moved on, married even for all I knew, and that the kindest thing I could do was leave it alone. I spent a year assuming you'd heard from me and chosen silence." He exhaled hard. "Then last night Sophie let it slip that you changed your number 2 years ago, after some breakup I don't even know the details of, which means you never got any of it. Which means for a year I thought you'd rejected me, and the truth is you never even knew I'd tried." I stood there with a cufflink box in my hand, doing the math on an entire year of my life, a year where I'd occasionally wondered about him late at night and told myself it was pathetic to still care. A year where he'd apparently done the exact same thing from the opposite side of a silence neither of us had actually chosen. "I didn't know," I said, which felt insultingly small for what he'd just handed me. "I know you didn't, that's the whole point. I spent a year being quietly furious at someone who never did anything wrong." He almost smiled, but it didn't quite make it. I don't know what to do with that information now that I have it, honestly. I just didn't want to get through this whole weekend without you knowing. What did the message say? I asked. The one I never got. He looked down at his half-done tie like it had suddenly become very interesting, that I still thought about you more than I probably should. That I was back in the country and I didn't know if that meant anything to you anymore, but I wanted to at least say it out loud once instead of wondering forever. He laughed, short and humorless. Feels a little anticlimactic, saying it now secondhand in a groomsman's suite with my tie half done. It doesn't feel anticlimactic, I said, quieter than I meant to. It just feels a year late through no one's fault. I didn't have an answer for him then. Sophie's coordinator was already calling my name down the hallway, hair and makeup, no time. And I left him still sitting there with his tie half done. And I walked through my best friend's wedding ceremony 20 minutes later with my chest so full I could barely get through my toast without my voice catching, and everyone assumed it was for Sophie. And it was, mostly. The reception ran long and golden, the way good ones do, and I danced with Todd once generously. And he seemed to understand something in the way I held myself that told him where the night was actually headed, because after that dance he squeezed my hand and said, "Go talk to him." I'll be fine, I mean it, and I have never in my life been more grateful for someone's decency. I found Marcus outside on the dock, away from the noise, tie fully undone now and hanging loose around his collar, looking out at the water like it owed him an answer. I keep thinking about all the versions of this year where I actually got that message, I said, coming to stand beside him. Me too. He didn't look at me right away. I've run through so many. All of them better than the one where I just gave up. You didn't give up, you tried. I'm the one who apparently vanished, through absolutely no fault of my own, which I have to say is a very unsatisfying kind of blameless. That got a real laugh out of him, low and surprised. And he finally turned to look at me, and the string lights from the reception behind us threw everything in this warm, unsteady gold, and for a second neither of us said anything at all. I'm not looking to just pick up where we left off, he said, quieter now. I know 6 years isn't nothing. I know you're not the same person and neither am I. I just don't want to walk away from this weekend telling myself it's too complicated to try. Not after finding out how close I came to never getting the chance to say any of this at all. So don't, I said. Walk away, I mean don't. I need you to know I'm not the guy who left for London without a fight anymore. I've had 6 years to sit with what that cost. I'm not interested in being careful with this a second time and losing it again over politeness. Then don't be careful, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I'm tired of both of us being so considerate we forget to actually say anything true. He reached over, slow, like he was giving me every opportunity to stop him, and brushed his thumb along my jaw. And I felt the entire 6 years collapse into the width of that dock, into the sound of the band still playing something slow behind us. The water moved black and quiet beneath the boards, string lights swaying faintly overhead, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. Just stood there in the specific kind of silence that means everything has already been decided. When he kissed me, it didn't feel like reopening something old. It felt like finally finishing a sentence we'd both left hanging for far too long. The music went on. The lake went dark and silver under the moon. Neither of us said much else that night that needs repeating here, only that it was tender and unhurried, and everything the version of us at 22 hadn't known how to be brave enough for. We didn't rush it after that either. He was still building a life back in the same city as me, still figuring out a job and an apartment and a version of himself that had spent 6 years somewhere else. And I had my own habits and my own guardedness to work through. We started slow and deliberate, dinners that weren't quite dates yet, long phone calls that ran past midnight the way they used to in college. Both of us determined not to lose another year to assumption and silence. He got a new number and made me put it in my phone myself, joking that he wasn't leaving anything to fate a second time. I introduced him to my parents again, and my mother, who had spent a full year trying to set me up with every eligible coworker Todd had ever mentioned. Cried actual tears over pot roast when she found out who he was. 6 months later, he came to my cousin's engagement party as my actual date. No seating chart engineering it, no accident of geography, just a choice made plainly in daylight. By two people who'd already learned the cost of leaving things unsaid. Sophie still takes full credit for the whole thing, which is generous of her considering she nearly let me find out about Marcus through the wedding program instead of in person. I let her have it anyway. Some things you don't argue with the people who love you about, especially when they turn out to have been right. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you. Really, it means a lot to me that you sat with this story start to finish. If stories like this one are your thing, stick around and follow along because there's always another one waiting. And I'd love to know, has this ever happened to you? Meeting someone again after years apart and feeling something you swore was long gone. Or maybe you've watched it happen to a friend, a sister, someone who thought that door was closed for good. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one.